Right, so I believe in your notes we're on page 8. That's where we're up to. But what we've done is remember we had a bit of a look at the Old Testament at a really, really high level. Then we're starting now to have a look through each book, and my plan for doing that in terms of each book is going to be to have just to open our Bibles and we'll walk through some major points in the book. Some will do a little bit more than others. Genesis we're going to do a lot, but we will go a little faster through some of the others, and then we'll go back and just have a look at some summary information around the book. So if you're following the notes, so today we're starting in Genesis on page 8. We may not actually get much more than the bottom of page 8, because what we're going to do is we're just going to pause here, open our Bibles, look through Genesis, then come back to the notes here. If that makes sense? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah,
yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah. So pausing on our notes on page 8 there. Look through Genesis, and then we'll come back. We'll see how far we get to. But I'm really prepared to spend a good chunk of time in Genesis. If we don't grasp Genesis, the rest of the story of Scripture just doesn't make sense. So here we go. Last week we got out to Cain and Abel, chapter 4. We really only just started. Are we okay if I flip this off or this down? Yeah. Hopefully it's nice and toasty warm in here now already. One of the things that we've just been in the youth group at the moment, we're tackling the topic of biblical sexuality for the term, and it's surprising. One of the places that we have to come back to all the time is Genesis, right? Genesis 1. We talked about it last week. Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Particularly 27, God created man in his own image, and male and female he created them. But actually it doesn't actually start there. It starts actually back in Genesis 1:1. And we've been thinking about the topic of biblical sexuality, really, which is just a subset of who we are, right? It's just a subset of our life. We have to take any particular part of life and start at Genesis 1:1, and in the beginning there was God, and God created the world. And the fact that he created means that he is the creator and he is the author. And that word author is the exact root word where we get the word authority. Right. So we see him as the creator and author, so he has the complete authority over absolutely everything that then comes in the rest of the book, including us. And that's the starting point for when our youth are looking at a topic like sexuality. Who is their authority in their life? Is it going to be God?
Yes.
They have to make that decision, right? Is it going to be God, or is it going to be themselves? Or some other authority that they're going to listen to on social media or whatnot? And that's the critical starting point question, isn't it? It's a critical starting point question for each of us in every single sphere of life. In the beginning, God created. Do we land there? Because if we land there and think, okay, yep, I believe that God created him, he is the author, and therefore he has the authority, then we go off on a biblical tangent. If we do not accept that he has the authority, then we go off on some other tangent, and we land in all sorts of other places. Even as we walk through the Bible, we land in all sorts of other places if we don't accept that. Cool. All right, we talked about Cain and Abel last week, and how that just sets a pattern of God's people being essentially being persecuted by those that were in power. And you think about the rest of the biblical narrative, you think about just the biblical stories that you know, just so often then we're going to see a pattern of God's people being afflicted and being persecuted by those in power, whether it's the Egyptians, whether it's the Babylonians, whether it's Rome at the time of Christ. And you think about church history, that has been the case throughout church history. Think about today, that's the turning of the tide right now. So that, I think Cain and Abel just kind of start to set up that tangent. And so after Cain and Abel, really they set, or Cain set in motion then a what you might call a descent. We understand from Genesis chapter 5. There's a chapter of kind of genealogy there, which sets out a pattern of a long period of time that brings us to chapter 6, verse 1. And when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. They took as their wives as they choose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Thinking back to chapter 5, because these guys so far have had very, very long lives. The next couple of verses, verse 4 just refers to the Nephilim. We're going to just park that because that's not a whole other idea and what on earth is going on there. But let's look at verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And there is this pattern that started in the garden at Genesis 3, continued and amplified with Cain and Abel, and then there's the descendants of Noah, where we see just at least a narrative there of who they were. But by the time we get to Noah, we have the wickedness of man was great. And the Lord said in verse 7, I'm going to blot out man who I've created from the face of the land, man and animals, creeping things, and the birds of the heavens, for I'm sorry that I've made them. But Noah found favour in the eyes of the Lord. So herein then starts a pattern of God's salvation. God's going to save his people, and he's going to save his people by doing a couple of things. One, he's going to put aside a remnant. He's going to put aside a remnant, and he's going to judge the evil, judge mankind, judge an evil portion of mankind. In Genesis 6 here, it's all of mankind. It's the whole kit and caboodle, right? Cool. So, but we start to see that pattern. That pattern's going to pop up time and time and time again. So God brings about his salvation through judgment of mankind. Cool. We happy with this so far? Nice.
There's a verse in chapter 5 that always stands out for me. God created us in his own image, but then in chapter 5 we read that Adam had a son in his own likeness and own image, and that's what really tells us that the effects of his sin in the Garden of Eden has come down on the rest of us.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. That's actually helpful. One theological, I guess, concept that we haven't talked about here is what's referred to as the federal headship of Adam, and all that's meaning is that Adam is our legal head. He's our legal head, and because he fathered a son. That's in chapter 5, verse 3. He fathered a son in his own likeness, after his own image, and remember, Adam had fallen by the stage. So the image of God was still in him, but it was marred, it was tarnished. And everyone since then has borne that image of Adam, which is a fallen, sinful image. So therefore, we also have inherited that sin of Adam, and what it's referred to as the federal headship of Adam. Now that has a significant implication in the fact that when we see a baby being born, in one sense we look at that child and we think there's innocence there, right? And in one sense there is, but in another sense there is already guilt, because that child is born in the image of Adam and already carries the sinfulness or the sin nature of Adam. That child is already a sinner by nature. parent, you know that you don't have to teach your child how to sin, right? You have to teach your child how to do right.
It also explains then the behaviour of mankind throughout Genesis.
That's right. Yeah, it does explain that chapter 6, verse 5, when the wickedness of man was great in all the earth. Cool. Thanks for that. So, the Noah and the flood is a critical point and a turning point. And notice that after the flood, once the flood subsides, we're not going to talk about the flood narrative itself. An interesting narrative in and of itself. God then makes a covenant, and that's in chapter 8, verses 20 and onwards. Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Here we go, the federal hedge of Adam coming through again. Neither will I ever strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So there's a covenant that God makes with Noah. He then carries on this covenant in chapter 9, verse 8. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I will establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is a sign of the covenant I will make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow, a rainbow, in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. All right, and the rest of the covenant narrative there kind of repeats it. So God was prepared now to set a. He had obviously clearly communicated with Adam, with Eve, presumably with Abel and Seth, and he had told Adam and Eve, particularly we saw a bit of a glimpse of that. We had told he had made an arrangement with Adam and Eve, right? He had told them, here's the whole garden, have at it, the whole lot, except one. And so that was his covenant with Adam. Adam broke that. Adam and Eve broke that covenant. And so what we now have is Noah or God making a covenant with Noah and giving him a little bit more information, giving him a little bit more detail to his communication and the interaction with Noah. We're going to see this again in a moment with Abraham. So what God is this is the idea of progressive revelation. God gives mankind a little bit, and then he's going to give mankind a little bit more, and a little bit more along the way. And as he does that, he adds to the information that mankind has. All right, we'll keep on rolling, and we're almost up to chapter 11. Now I said earlier on, Genesis 1 to 11, remember, covers probably the first 2,000 years of human history. And if the Old Testament is approximately 4,000 years of human history, Genesis 1 to 11, that's half of the Old Testament, right there, Genesis 1 to 11, right? So actually we've covered a massive space of time in a very short space of time, if that makes sense. So, then we get to the Tower of Babel. Just a quick note, if you're reading through Genesis 1 to 11, and you come across chapter 10, and then you think, hold on, how does chapter 10 relate to chapter 11? Chapter 10 chronologically would be after chapter 11. Essentially what it's doing is giving a bit of a idea of all the nations that actually then came out of the Tower of Babel, right? So it's a typical Hebrew way of approaching writing something. If the most important thing is that beginning and end of a segment begin and end exactly how the author wanted them to. And I think the author, Moses, was wanting to end this segment at the Tower of Babel. That was the critical theological point. The descendants part was also important, but he decided to slot that in before the Tower of Babel. So it doesn't make, we would have written it differently, right? Because we're Westerners, everything has to be chronological. Just so we're aware of that. So the Tower of Babel. Here it is. Now, there's a couple of really interesting things about Tower of Babel, which again is a pattern for all of mankind. Verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Sinai and settled there. Now, remember, God had told both Adam and Eve and Noah that they had to go forth and multiply, right? That fill the earth, right? So that was part of their mandate. Go forth, multiply, and to fill the earth. What is mankind doing here? They found a plain in the land of Sinai and settled there. They all came into one place, and they didn't go out and multiply and fill the earth. They just came and settled in one place here, right? And they said to one another, "Come, let us build bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Right? Not a name for God, not bring glory to God, but let's make a name for ourselves, lest we just be dispersed over the face of the whole earth, which was what they were supposed to do, right? Go forth, multiply, and fill the whole earth. And so what were they wanting to do? They were wanting to go up to God. Right, they wanted to build a tower to go up to God. What did God do? In the next verse, and the Lord came down. Right? Again, just thinking about our position. The Lord God has to come down to us. We might try and make our way up to God. We might try and build ourselves a great name. We might even try and earn our way into heaven, right? No, God has to come down to us. And so God came down to see the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people and they have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do now will be impossible for them. Come, let us," there's a Trinitarian reference just right there, by the way. "Come, let us go down there and confuse their language so they may not understand one another's speech." And so God did exactly that. He dispersed them out from over there, all of the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And then we have a little bit more of a description of the descendants that came from Noah. Genesis 1 to 11, 2,000 years we covered in last week, and then another 20 minutes. Were you all good with that? Okay, let's keep rolling then. Because we get to this central character called Abraham. And a lot's going to happen in chapters 12 through to 17, so we just need to have a bit of a see of what is happening here. Firstly, God calls Abraham. And he calls him, and I think this is probably, again, helpful and instructive for all of mankind, but for us. God calls him to do something that logically doesn't really make sense. So God said to Abraham, now actually, let's look at just at the back of just a section, a segment in chapter 11:31. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarah his wife. Sarah his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. But there they came to Haran and settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So there's where they are, and the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I'll make a great nation, and I will bless you, and I'll make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." A whole lot packaged up in there. Firstly, Abram has to leave the land of Haran. He has to leave the land of Haran, which we understand a little bit later from the narrative. Actually, they are well set up there. They are well set up there. So what God is asking Abram to do is all this good stuff. He is asking Abram and his wife to leave there, which makes no logical sense. For their setting there, it makes absolutely no logical sense that they should go out of all the blessing that God has given them, all the comfort that God has given them. That God is going to take them and take them on a journey, and He will give them plenty. He will give them the land of Canaan, and He will make a great nation out of them. Also, right then and there, we also see that in verse 3, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Notice it doesn't say all the families of my people Israel will be blessed. It's all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Right from the beginning, the intention of God was for this to be a blessing to the entire world. All right, so Abraham went and did that. They had a detour in Egypt. We won't cover that too much. We won't worry about Lot too much, and just in our fly through here. But let's start then going back into chapter 15. God's covenant with Abraham. So we had a covenant. It wasn't explicitly mentioned as a covenant. Sorry, is it getting cold in here again? Mm-hmm. Interesting. Sorry. I'll put that on, and I might just turn the fan down a little bit if that's all right. So in chapter 15, yes. So we're going to have the covenant with Abraham. It wasn't explicitly mentioned, but God did make a covenant, an agreement with Adam, didn't He? He said there was an agreement that He made with Adam. And then we have another covenant that God makes with Noah. And by the way, Noah messes that covenant up pretty quickly, right? He gets drunk and plays around naked. And anyway, so he messes that up pretty quickly. God now makes another covenant with Abraham. But this covenant just has a bit of a different twist compared to the other two covenants that have come before them. I think we need to. Paul does something when Paul talks about the Abrahamic covenant in Galatians. What he does is do two things, which I think allows us to do the same thing with the text here. We have the covenant described in chapter 15, and then the covenant also described in chapter 17. If you see, even if you've got your Bible there, you've probably got in chapter 15 probably the heading that is that the translators have given this is something like God's covenant with Abraham, if you've got an ESV. Then in 16 you've got a little bit of a narrative around Sarah and Hagar, but then in 17 you've got the covenant of circumcision happening again, and what Paul does is he actually puts those two covenants together and assumes that they are one, right? So what God's doing here is making a covenant with Abraham, but he's essentially giving it to him in two stages. So one covenant that he makes with Abraham, two parts to it. So I think we can also do the same. If Paul's going to do it, if Paul interprets it as one covenant, it's not two covenants, it's one covenant with just part A, part B, we can do the same. It's important because, here we go. I'm just want to make sure I pick up the important parts here. So, verse 3. Behold, you've given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir, in terms of like one of my servants will be my heir. Behold, the word of God, the Lord came to him. This is chapter 15, verse 4 now. This man shall not be your heir, but your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, look toward the heaven, the number of stars, if you are able to number them. He said to them, so shall your offspring be. And Abraham believed the Lord, and it was counted, and he counted it to him as righteousness. So his belief in the Lord was counted as Abraham's righteousness. Paul's going to pick up on that and say that's how we have righteousness. It's not because of our deeds, it's because of our belief and our faith, right? So here comes justification by faith early on in the Bible. Like I said, got to get a good handle on Genesis to understand the rest of the Bible. All right, so let's let's carry on here. So what Abraham does, or God asks Abraham to bring him a heifer, a male goat, a ram, a turtle dove. What the idea here is that there's a covenant going to be made, and the Hebrew word for making a covenant is actually cutting a covenant, which is interesting because in ancient Near East, where Abraham and his family lived, the custom was that if you were going to make a covenant with someone, say one king with another king, or even just one landowner with another landowner, you're going to make a covenant, you're going to make an agreement here. And what you would do is you'd bring some animals together and you would literally cut them. And you would put half over here and half over here. Yeah, pretty gory. And you would walk, and both parties would walk between them. And what you were saying there, what the implication was, is if I don't hold up my part of this agreement, let it be to me as it is to these animals. Right? That was a symbolism of walking through. Right? So pretty hefty fines for not holding up your part of the contract, right? So, and we see exactly doing that, except because in verse 10 he brought them all together. Abraham brought them all together, cut them in half, laid each half over each other, and then in verse 12 something strange happens. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abraham. And behold, a dreadful and great darkness fell on him. And the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners, that is, ones who travel, gypsies, you might say. I was looking for the right word there. Sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nations they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried at good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Right, here we go. And then, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. And on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river. And then he describes the land a little bit more. All right, so there's part one, part A of this covenant. We're going to come back to the fact that Abraham fell asleep during it all in just a moment. And then in chapter 17, he makes a covenant here, or continues on the covenant. Let's pick it up in verse 4. Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be, this is chapter 17, verse 4. And you shall be a father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but you shall be called Abraham. And I've made you the father of a multitude of nations. You'll be exceedingly fruitful, and I'll make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I'll establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring, and throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. That's important words there. To be God to you. And I will give you and your offspring after you the land of your sojournings. And all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And then in verse 9, God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant. What is the covenant for Abraham? Well, realistically, at part A, I'm going to be your God, right? That's part A. And then secondly, one of the signs there is going to be circumcision. Okay, so from verses 10 onwards, we just get that pattern of circumcision. Now here's the thing: did Abraham and all his descendants down through the ages keep this covenant? Did they keep God as their God? No. Did they even keep circumcision? Sometimes, most of the time perhaps, but not all the time, right? So, let's go back to the covenant part, the cutting of the covenant in chapter 15. If it was a normal covenant, God would have gone through the animals, and Abraham would have gone through the animals symbolically as a head of his nation. But what happened to Abraham? He fell asleep, right? So he didn't go through. Only God went through this covenant here. So essentially what God was saying here is, I know you're not going to keep the covenant. You guys can't. I've seen all your descendants, right? Back to Cain and Abel, and Noah, and then all the other guys around them. You guys can't keep the covenant with me. So I'm not going to let you go through the cutting of the covenant. So what God was saying here essentially is, by being the only one going through the covenant, and that with the smoking pot and the flaming torch, he was saying essentially, I am bearing the responsibility of both parties for this covenant. If either side, and God was never going to let up his side, right? But if either side doesn't hold true to this covenant, I'm going to take the punishment. So one clear thing coming out of this: if Jesus is not God, then God's a liar, because he didn't take the punishment that he said he would in this covenant here. I think this is a massive development here as we walk through Genesis. Tony, we're going to say so.
Does this not also signify that amongst people, when they make a covenant and they cut the animals and they both walk through, in this particular instance, the covenant was made by God. It was not made by God and man.
Mm-hmm.
So the covenant was actually only made by one party.
Yeah, which is fair, which is actually the pattern of God's making a covenant with mankind all the way through, right? It's always God initiating, God setting down the terms, which he's allowed to do, right? Okay.
Wouldn't it just be interpreted as by God going through it alone, that here's what I'm going to do for you, and you don't have to do anything for it, as opposed to him also taking the punishment of the other party? You see what I mean?
I mean, you could, I mean, there's the history of interpretation probably falls both ways. That there is an element of this is all God's work, right? It's all God's work. We can't put anything to it. Yet, as we head further through, and we're going to pick it up in where's it going to come in Deuteronomy, I believe. There is going to be that continuing on of this covenant is just like we're going to get little bits added to it, and there's going to be the blessings and the cursings, right? If you follow my ways, you will be blessed. If you don't, here's the curses. So there is an element of yes, this is all God's work, and yet still he still requires something of us. So the history of interpretation falls probably, to be fair, both ways. The picture I think that we get here, though, is that there is an expectation, because God does ask Abraham that just two things: one very broad, one very specific. That here's your part of the bargain. That I'm going to be your God. That and that comes out in Exodus 20 in the Ten Commandments. I'm going to be your God, and I want you to put the sign of circumcision in for you. So that which leads me to sort of lean on the fact that actually no, God is asking. There is still a two-part scenario here to the.
Yeah, sorry. I think all I was saying was that the fact that Abraham didn't go through the covenant meant that God was going to chop him in half when he failed.
Right. Sure.
As opposed to God. I think what you were saying is that God would chop himself in half. Continue the analogy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I don't know if God was saying he would accept the punishment as opposed to he just wouldn't inflict his right.
Well, the idea of these covenants, though, it was that there was going to be a punishment for either party that was coming into the covenant, and the walking through was symbolising, yeah, I'm okay with taking that. And so one party said, yeah, I'm okay with taking that. Another party didn't go through that.
Which Jesus did eventually when he died on the cross.
That's right.
I mean, that comes through that.
Yeah. So I think that's the idea, right? There was a payment that happened for one side not not upholding their end of the bargain.
What was the part of the bargain in these covenants?
In the covenants,
What part was failed that Christ had to be paid for?
The part that was failed is that you will keep me as I will be your God. And I think the rest of, certainly the Pentateuch, the rest of Exodus through Deuteronomy, just teases that out further and further in terms of this is how it is that you will be my God. Plus, then explicitly, you also have the circumcision in chapter 17. That's going to be a sign there. So, which some keep and some don't, right? There's a whole generation that has to be circumcised as adults because they haven't kept that part of their bargain. So, all right. Covenant with Abraham, though, start as a significant part in Genesis, because it really again sets up the idea that God's people is going to come from this guy Abraham, and there is going to be a line directly down through Abraham, and his offspring will be the one who is promised. And that offspring ultimately comes as Jesus, right? Cool. Let's keep on moving. We want to just make sure we at least cover Genesis today. So the story then quickly turns to Abraham's descendants. So we have Isaac, and then we have Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah. So the birth of Isaac happens in 21, and we should talk very quickly about Hagar and Ishmael. I remember seeing. Do you guys remember seeing the? Remember the story, The West Wing? Sorry, the story. There was a series called The West Wing. It was set in. It was set in the White House, and it was just probably in the 90s, early 2000s, and it was just a fantastic drama that just completely fictional, but was in the West Wing of the White House setting. And the beauty of this was just that the authors were just had incredible dialogue. So it was a wonderful thing to watch, just because there was incredible dialogue going on around it. They were obviously very quick writers in terms of a quick mind, and incredible actors that acted that out. And then September 11 happened. Literally 3 days later, they produced an episode of the West Wing that was an aftermath of 9/11, right? So they had assumed in their narrative, obviously they've got a different president in their narrative, but their narrative was kind of paralleling along with it was Clinton and then Bush, and 3 days later they put out a episode that was realizing, okay, so it's 9/11 has happened. What's happening in the West Wing version of the president? I was fascinated because the title of that episode was Isaac and Ishmael. Very, very insightful. Because obviously their assumption 3 days after 9/11 was that this was as Islamic extremists that had perpetrated this. All right, and they realised that, you know what, the history of Islamic extremism and the everything that's going on in the Middle East, all and that incredible history all goes back to Isaac and Ishmael. It's right here in Genesis, right? Isaac and Ishmael. So what we've got here is Isaac, the promised one. Abraham, though, not believing, and here's even like his stumbling in this covenant already, not believing God was going to do what God had told him to do, then listened to Sarah and then went and had a child with their slave, Hagar. And so you have Ishmael being born, and then Ishmael then becomes the father of all the Arab nations. Isaac then becomes, through Jacob and his line, becomes the father of the nation of Israel. And of course, Paul picks up on this later on. It's a really, really important distinction that we make here. Isaac and Ishmael. He actually talks about their mothers, right? Sarah and Hagar, or Hagar and Ishmael's mother, and Sarah. And says that actually, this is the pattern here again for not just for human history, but for our spiritual lives. We are either going to be a child of the slave woman, or we're going to try to be a child of the free woman. And our inheritance in Christ makes us part of Abraham's family in the line of Isaac, the free daughter, a son or daughter of the free woman. So this tension between Isaac and Ishmael is a very real historic tension that happened then, and it's a very real historic tension that is happening now. What is that, 3,500 years later or more? And it's a very real tension that is still happening in us. That we are children of the free woman, and yet we still feel the tension of our old life as a child of slavery. And just like the Egyptians, we still hark back and think, oh, it wasn't so bad in that slavery. I want to go back to my old life of sin. Yeah, that tension there between those two people still happens in us and still happens in our lives. All right. So we have Isaac, and Isaac is born in chapter 21, and we're going to go faster now. And then hit chapter 22, the sacrifice of Isaac, and that's where we're going to end today. The sacrifice of Isaac. We've got to have a look at what happened there. See you guys. Thanks, sorry guys. Thank you. Yeah, all good. You guys have to take part in the service there. We'll have a quick look at Abraham. God saying to Abraham, take your son, this is 22 verse 2, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and you're going to burn him in the land of Moriah, on one of the mountains I will set before you. And so what does Abraham do? He says, yeah, okay, I'll take my son, the only son that I have, and I'm going to place him on an altar there and sacrifice him. So in verse 6, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering. Okay, so he's taking wood up on the altar there. And Abraham asks as he's going up, this is verse 7. It says, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham says, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. Which is so symbolic, obviously, for the Lamb of God being provided. Abraham didn't realise that God was going to provide a ram caught in a thicket. So Abraham, they get there, they put the wood on the altar, and he bound Isaac his son and laid Isaac on the altar on the top of the wood. We've got to look at this narrative and realise we don't know exactly what age Isaac was. He's probably an adult though. He's probably an adult, and so Isaac could have gotten away, right? Because remember, by the time Isaac was born, Abraham's an old man. So it was going to be pretty easy for Isaac to get away. So clearly Isaac willingly went and laid there. Abraham reached out his hand to his knife to slaughter his son. You can't imagine that, can you? But the angel of the Lord came and said, Abraham, Abraham. Abraham said, here I am. Do not lay your hand on the boy. And then there's a ram in the thicket, and God provides the ram instead of his son. Such symbolism there, which is just an incredible parallel to the cross, right? And from a number of different angles. Firstly, his son being laid on the wood and being ready to sacrifice his son, and then the story twists in the fact that a substitute lamb essentially has been given for Isaac. So from both angles pointing to Jesus, right? Isaac himself being willing to be sacrificed, pointing to Jesus willing to sacrifice. Then the lamb, the ram being provided as the substitute, again pointing to Jesus so that we don't have to pay for that sin.